I want to dive into this next portion of the study of Galatians. I mentioned last week these people called the Judaizers. And I said that the Judaizers were people who were coming into the church, and what they were doing is they were trying to redefine what it means to be saved. What does it mean to have salvation? What does it mean to be approved by God? What does it mean to be justified? Am I okay with God? What does it actually take for me and God to be good? What do I need to do? What do I have to do? And there are many ideas in this room even, I'm sure, as to what does it take and what does it mean. And Paul, we talked about Paul, who showed up in this place called Galatia, and he preached this gospel about Jesus Christ, and he shared everything about who God was. And these Gentiles, they were not Jews, they were pagans. They converted and they had faith in Jesus Christ. And then these Judaizers came, and then they started to spoil the message. They started to add in little details into what it takes to actually have a right relationship with God. And these Judaizers were ruining people's faith because they were calling them to legalism. Legalism simply means that you're trying to work, you're trying to earn your way, you're trying to follow rules in order to gain your salvation. And so what Paul is writing in this letter, he finds out that these people are starting to convert from Christianity into this mixture of Christianity and Judaism. And so they were doing things like, well, we need to eat kosher in order to be saved. And we need to circumcise our children in order to be saved. And we need to do all of these things in order to be saved. So Paul pens this letter to the churches in Galatia for this very reason. Last week I talked about how this letter would have been written, how it's composed by Paul, it was sent by someone, and that the churches in Galatia were small home churches. So these people did not get Sunday morning services. They did not have a book and a Bible with everything. So when they got a letter from Paul, it was something significant because they were finally getting a teaching. They were finally getting correction. They were finally getting something, right? They were finally getting something from Paul to help them to know what they need to do going forward. And because most people were not literate in those days, only a few people could actually read. Those educated teachers of the law, they could read. And so somebody would get up in a public setting just like this one, and they would gather the churches in Galatia as close as they could, and if someone would read this letter publicly from top to bottom, they would read this letter from Paul, and people would sit back and just listen, and they would learn, and then they would read it day after day, day after day. And 2,000 years later, we're still reading it because it is an instruction from Paul. And tonight, I want to spend some time on what Paul is doing, because Paul is trying to answer a question that I've asked myself many a times, and the people in Galatia were asking, why should we believe you, Paul? Why should we believe you? For those of you who don't know, I spent a good portion of my teenage and adult life as a functional atheist, and I graduated from being an atheist to an agnostic, and so I spent a lot of my time actually on this. And throughout the past 2 weeks, as I've been just going through this study, it has been a challenge for me personally, if I could just be transparent, because the biggest struggle that I have, believe it or not, is my faith. I wrestle with my faith more than anything else, still, until this day, because I've spent so much of just my time in my life before I became a Christian investigating and discovering why Christianity is fake, and why it couldn't work, and why it didn't work, and why why God didn't exist, and I've just always wrestled with my faith, and some of you are looking at me like, not you, Pastor Denvil, not you, but you're so passionate about it. But it's just a real struggle of mine, and some of you have that struggle too. And if you have that struggle where you wake up some days and you're like, oh man, I just have a hard time with this, it's okay, because these people did too. And Paul was writing to Christians. He wasn't writing to people to convert them. He was writing to people who believed, but they just needed to be strengthened in their faith. And even as a pastor, I need to be strengthened in my faith, because I wrestle with my belief in Jesus. There's some days I wake up, and sometimes I watch the news, and sometimes things happen, and I'm like, how could there be a God? So as I go through this, it is a struggle for me personally, and so I want to share some things that I think might be beneficial, that helps me, And for those of you who perhaps wrestle with the same thing, it'll help you. And for those of you who never think about these things, hopefully you'll just get something and you'll be able to help people out there who are like me and others around us who just wrestle with our faith, all right? And so I asked the question, and I want to give you guys like 3 to 5 minutes to wrestle with this question that has ruined me for the past 2 weeks. I've had 2 weeks to wrestle with it, and I'm still wrestling, but I want to give you guys 5 minutes to do it so you can be ruined and to be ready for what I'm going to talk about. So the question goes like this, and it's actually in the first chapter of the little book that you have here. You can put that question up on the screen. It's in chapter 1 on page 1, and the question is, how do you determine whether a teacher or preacher is trustworthy? How do you know that what the person is saying is true? And I've wrestled with this because my Bible is written by people who wrote it, and I'm very aware of that there was not a divine finger that came down and wrote my Bible. We talked about this for 11 weeks in our last Bible study, that God did not come down and sovereignly write it, that Paul wrote this letter. And so why should I trust Paul? Why should I mess my life up? Why should I move around my things? Why should I give my heart, my time, my affection because Paul said so? Like, who is Paul? Right? And so the question is surrounding this place of Galatians, saying for people who are pagans and come this little Jewish man, Paul, and Paul is preaching this gospel, why would they believe it? And if you could, I want you to take some time and just share your answer with someone at your table. If you don't have an answer, just listen to somebody else's. And I think this is a really good question, and I want to unravel this a little bit tonight. How do you determine whether a teacher or preacher is trustworthy? When you turn on YouTube and somebody starts to teach you, because I know there's some YouTube churchgoers in here. You ain't got to raise your hand, don't worry. I'm not going to check your history. But how do you know if that teacher is trustworthy? And then you go to the Bible. How do you know if that teacher is... So take a few minutes and just share. What do you think? How would you go about, personally, how would you go about verifying if a teacher of the gospel is trustworthy? What would you do? Go. Can Christianity, can the message that Paul is preaching, can it be trusted for those of us in this room who are giving our lives to Jesus? This is the portion of the letter where Paul is addressing this question because their faith is at risk. Their faith is at risk, not because tragedy has happened, but because someone is questioning Paul and the message that Paul is bringing. And so just in general, these are pagans, these are not Jews. They're asking the question, can Christianity be trusted? And so the basis of approaching this topic, and this is what Paul does all throughout this letter. I'm going to just give you a quick walkthrough of how we can walk through understanding if Christianity is real, and then we'll look at what Paul tells this church. Christianity begins with Jesus. Christianity begins with Jesus. And if you were in our previous Bible study, we talked about how Christianity does not begin with God. Christianity begins with Jesus. And I know that many of you in this room had an idea of God, and then you found out about Jesus. And then you realize, well, Jesus is God, and God was before, so then I believe in God, and then I believe in Jesus. But if you believe in God, and then you believe in Jesus, then there's something wrong with the matter because you have a definition of God that doesn't exist in Jesus. And if you have an idea of God that doesn't exist in Jesus, then where did you get that idea from? What is he like? So Christianity actually begins with Jesus. And Jesus comes, and Jesus is not starting a new religion. Jesus actually connects himself in the birth religion that he's in, Judaism. So Christianity begins with Jesus. We start off by believing Jesus. One preacher helped me a lot. He said this: if somebody can predict their own death and pull it off, we just believe them. Predict their own death, pull it off, and say they're going to come back, and they come back. Jesus said things like, just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, so will the Son of Man be in the grave for 3 days, and he'll come back again. Jesus said things like, if you tear down this temple, I can rebuild it in 3 days. He said things like, nobody takes my life, but I give it up willingly. If you can predict your own death and tell me what it's going to do, and then you actually do it and come back, then I'm going to believe a little bit of what you say. Right? And so Christianity begins with Jesus. If Jesus died and never came back, Christianity would not be. You would not have a church. You would not have the Miami Vineyard. We would be pagans. We would be worshiping God knows what, God knows where, God knows who. It begins with Jesus. You did not have an idea of God, and then you discover Jesus. And if you did, that needs to be realigned because Jesus says, no one can see the Father except through me. And if you've seen the Father except through Jesus, then Jesus says you need to rediscover the Father. And then he goes on and he explains things like that he's connected to a faith. In Genesis 22 is where Judaism begins. Jesus points backwards to Judaism, and he says, I'm actually here to fulfill and continue the promise of Judaism, which was, God says to Abraham, through your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so Jesus does not start off with God. He starts off with the promise of Abraham back in the Old Testament into Judaism. And when Jesus comes, he does not start something new. He always says, if you look at this next slide, Luke 24, this was the basis of teaching the Bible. Jesus, after the resurrection, he comes back and he finds his disciples and he teaches them. And he teaches them about himself from the Old Testament Bible. He says, I'm connected to that. If you want to understand my mission and my vision, if I'm real, you need to be connected with the Old Testament. You need to be connected with the promise of the Old Testament. What did God promise? God said, I'm going to take this one man, Abram, make a Jewish people, and through them, you all are going to be blessed. Jesus comes on the scene and says, I'm here to do that. And so Jesus teaches this way. He says, he taught them and he says, let me tell you about myself through the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, right? We talked about the Torah, which is the first section of the Old Testament, the Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and the Ketuvim. If you are like, what does he speak in French? There's another Bible study that we did. It's called The Story of the Bible. If you ask me or Gwen, we can send you, it's like 11 videos of me teaching through this, right? So Jesus comes and he's pointing back to the Old Testament and saying, if you want to understand me and my mission, it starts back there. And what I'm doing today, you have to understand what I was doing back then because I'm connected to that reality. And so when you're reading the Old Testament, if you read the Old Testament and all you find are arguments for creation, you miss the point. If you read the Old Testament and all you figured out is rules and good sayings and stuff to post on Instagram, you've missed what Jesus said to do. He said, when you look back there, you should find me. And if all you found were arguments to have and rules to follow, you've missed what I told you to look for. The only reason why you're interested in the Old Testament is because of Jesus. I asked the question, why would you read ancient Hebrew scriptures? You have no interest, you have no desire in ancient Hebrew scriptures. The only reason you and I study ancient Hebrew scripture, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, the only reason you care is because Jesus says, I'm back there. If not, you wouldn't have done it. Because there's a bunch of ancient literature in South Africa, a bunch of it in India. You don't care about it. You care about Hebrew, ancient culture, because Jesus said, I'm back there. So when you go back there, you have to find him. If all you found were some answers and some good sayings and laws to follow, 10 commandments, if that's all you have, he says, go back and look again, because you should be finding me in there. And he didn't say that you should find morality. He didn't say you should find some rules for you to follow and that you should keep them. Because Jesus, we talked about last week, is not primarily a teacher. He's a rescuer. He says, if you want to find out what I am doing, find out the promises that were back there. I'm here to rescue humanity. I'm not here to teach humanity. I am a teacher. I am here to rescue humanity. And so when you go back there, I want you to find the promises of rescue. I want you to find when Adam and Eve messed up and God killed an animal and covered them. I want you to find me in that picture. Who am I? He said, before you even messed up, I was covering you. And we see this picture. He says, I want you to find me in every text of the Old Testament because that's what it is there for. And Jesus is the rescuer. So we begin with Jesus, and then he points to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we trust those writers. We trust the Old Testament because God chose these people. God revealed himself through these people. Things like heaven. For those of you who have ideas about heaven and who should go and who shouldn't go, you don't get to decide that because it's not your idea. Right? Like, you didn't come up with it. So you don't get to decide. So what Jesus is doing here, Jesus is saying you have to trust this Old Testament. You have to trust what's going on back there. And the Old Testament has evidence and history, and Jesus connects and points himself to that fully and completely. And then when it comes to the New Testament, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament, and then he promises the same thing in the New Testament writings. 400 years go by after the Old Testament is compiled. They have the Jewish Bible. Comes this man, Jesus. He says, I'm here to fulfill what that promise was. I'm here to rescue all of humanity. I'm here so that God's blessing can fill all of humanity. That is why I'm here. And then he says, I'm going to call these 12 men together and some women, and I'm going to call them together, and their job is going to be to carry out this mission. I'm going to live my life before them, and I'm going to show them what I can do. Other people are going to witness it, but these are the 12. 12. These are the ones I reveal myself to. They're the ones that are going to carry it out because I'm going to die and resurrect. I'm going to prove myself to many, but I'm going to call 12, and I want you to listen to them just like you listen to the Old Testament. Matthew 28, he tells his disciples, "Go ye therefore into all the nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and teach them everything I've taught you." And so that's why I trust my Bible. Because it's not just because somebody told me it's God's book and so I should read it. We're not just people of faith blindly, we're thinkers. We have to use our minds to also connect with our hearts, right? And so the question now is, Christianity has begun. The churches are being planted. It's been about 15 years since Jesus has died. And these apostles, the disciples, they're going out, they're starting churches. And there are 12 disciples. One of them died, and his name is? His name is? Judas, the one who died. You guys remember Judas died? All right, so there were 11 disciples because Judas died, and they replaced him with someone named? Oh, what? Okay, right? So this is a crazy story. Judas dies, and then the 11 disciples are like, "Oh my gosh, we need to have 12 because 12 is this really cool number, and we've got to have 12 of them because Judas died." And so they cast lots. They did this little weird draw sticks kind of thing, and who should do it? Any, mini, miny, mo, we pick you, Matthias, and then they picked him, and he became 12. But they picked him. But I want you to know tonight that even though that was their pick, that was not God's pick. God picked a man named Saul, made him his apostle, and said, "I choose you to fill the place of the 12. And I just want to let you know that because a lot of people think that if because the apostle picked somebody that was God's pick. If nobody picks you, God can still pick you. He'll pick you divinely. He could pick you like how he picked Saul. He picked him right off his high horse. He was riding a high horse, and he was going where he was going, and he was doing his thing. And God says, they chose Matthias, but I'm going to choose you. And so Saul was on his way to kill some Christians because he was a Jew. He was a good Jew, and that's what you do when you're a good Jew. You kill bad Jews. I don't know why, that's just what they did, right? And so as a persecutor now, these people are coming in and they're messing up Judaism altogether. And then Saul says, I'm a defender of the faith, and they're messing it up. And so he goes on his way, and while he's on his way, he's on this horse, and Jesus appears to him and says, stop it. I choose you. You're going to go and be my 12th disciple. I love Matthias, but it's not him. I choose you, and I want you to go and be an apostle to the Gentiles. So he shows up in this place called Galatia, he tells them the gospel, and then he's going on, and then he finds out there's some other people who are coming in, and they're teaching you some other things that he didn't teach them, and now he's trying to defend himself as to why they should believe him. And Paul, we understand, is a carrier of the message. So if you're taking notes, I want you to write this. In number 1, Jesus revealed the gospel message to the apostles. Paul writes in Galatians 1:11, he says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man. I was not taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. I received it from revelation. Jesus died. He rose. We thought he was gone, but he showed up and he taught me something. And so to answer this question as to how do I know that this is true? How do I know that it is real? Paul calls it a gospel. Gospel means good news because it is good. I know that it is from God because nothing is good unless it finds a source from God. And Paul says that this is the message, this is the news that it's not just here to tickle your brain and make you think and to educate you. He says the gospel is going to challenge your passion. It is going to speak to your heart in a profound way. That the gospel is going to be surreal, that it is not just something you hear and decide to believe, but something happens in your heart when you experience the gospel. He says, I didn't just hear the gospel, it was revealed to me. I was on my horse, I encountered the gospel. I am a carrier of the gospel. I carry the gospel in my body because I experienced it in real life. I was a killer, and God changed me. And so I don't know what you believe about God and about the gospel, but I believe that he changes. The gospel is a powerful gospel that changes. Paul says, I'm an experienced man of the gospel, not just in its telling, but in its actions. And Paul is explaining that the power of the gospel is inexplainable. Some of you have tried to explain grace and God. It's like it's in my heart. And it's like, what? It's probably heartburn. No, Like, you don't understand. Like, during worship, it's like, oh, like, I feel, like, Paul is saying, like, the gospel message is deep. And Paul is saying, the message that I gave you, I didn't come up with it. It wasn't revealed to me. It was Jesus himself that gave me the experience of it. And after he gave me the experience of it, he gave me the message of it. Paul writes in verse 10, he says, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be God's servant. And I want you to remember here and recognize that Paul, we'll read this in a little bit, that Paul was a Jew. Not only was a Jew, he was a professional Jew, right? Just like how I'm a professional Christian, right? He was a professional Jew. He studied his whole entire life to actually teach in the synagogue. He memorized the entire Torah. Like, he studied his entire life. He followed the law. He followed the Mishnah. He followed everything the way that he should. And the reason he did it was so that his community could look at him. And that God would look at him. And he did it to impress God and to impress people. And I want you to understand that he gave his entire life to that. And if you want to highlight verse 10, I think this is really important. When Paul became a Christian, he was rejected by Jews because he turned his back on the very people who he was trying to impress. You guys are with me? He was a Jew in the temple. Now he is blaspheming the name of God according to the Jews, because he's saying that God is a man named Jesus. And so he used to persecute these people. Now he's become one of them. And the people who he used to try to impress now reject him. Some of you understand what I mean by that. You try to impress somebody so much, you give them everything until you let them down, and it's like they turn their back on you. Paul said this whole community would have turned his back on him because he rejected the thing that they were teaching. But not only is he rejected by his community, he's rejected by the community that he's going into, because they're like, you used to persecute us. Paul is stuck in between two communities. And Paul says, if you think I'm trying to impress you, I'm not, because I've already lost everything here. Nobody likes me here, and nobody likes me here. I'm not trying to impress anybody. Anything I say, I'm going to lose anybody either way. And there's just something that releases us, I believe, in the gospel that frees you from the fear of man, that frees you from the fear of people, trying to please everybody, trying to be everything for everybody. Because when you realize that you're loved by God, it snatches that thing right out of you, because he will never leave you. He'll never reject you. And so Paul says, I found a lover that's greater than the Jews. I found a lover that's greater than the Gentiles. If you think I'm trying to please anybody, let me tell you what the gospel of grace has done. It's not just a message in my mouth, but it's in my life and in my heart. This is the power of the gospel. It'll make you stop trying to impress people. It'll make you stop trying to make somebody love you. Because when you got the greatest lover, it doesn't matter who loves you, right? Paul is standing on the fringes here. And that's why I want you to highlight verse 10. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings? Y'all don't like me that way, right? Y'all don't like me anyway. Or am I trying to I said, if I was trying to, I wouldn't be Christ's servant. I would have just gone back to Judaism if I was trying to please people. I'm going to write this verse on Proverbs 29, verse 25. It says, the fear of man will prove to be a snare. 29, verse 25. It says, the fear of man will prove to be a snare. Because when you don't know that you are loved, you will work for it. When you don't know that you're accepted, you will work for it. That is the problem when we walk away from grace. You walk away from the grace that saves you, and you step into being real and being human and being mature and being smart. You find yourself starting to work for the acceptance and the love and the value that only Jesus can give. Paul says, I've experienced the gospel in a real way. This is not just tongue-in-cheek. This is not just words I'm giving you. Look at my life. I stand on the fringes. I stand on the fringes of society to bring you this message. The second thing I want you to write down here is that the gospel is one size fits all. Now, ladies, I know you don't believe in one size fits all. I've heard that one size fits all is not a real thing, because somehow they didn't consider my size. But the gospel is a one size fits all. Paul goes on, he says, for you have heard my previous way of life in Judaism, how I intensely persecuted the church and I tried to destroy it, and I was advancing in Judaism beyond many my own age, among people who were extremely zealous of the traditions of my fathers. But God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him to the Gentiles. The grace of God and the gospel has to be a one-size-fits-all, because you remember God's plan and promise was to all nations. He says, Abram, I'm going to make you a blessing to all nations. Jesus comes and says, I'm here to fulfill that. So whatever Jesus is about to do has to fit every single person. Now, to have a religion and a faith or anything that's going to be a one-size-fits-all is probably going to be an impossible task. But Paul is experiencing this one-size-fits-all, because he says that there's no one who is too good for the gospel. Nobody's too good for the gospel, because all of your good works have to account for the bad works. All of the good things that you do, like there's some bad things that are behind that. And so for some people who say that good people should be saved, like I can't believe that a murderer in prison gets salvation, but my friend who brings cupcakes every Christmas, why is she not going? What about Susie, right? And I'm telling you, I don't care about Susie, because what it takes is not baking cupcakes. If you could bake cupcakes into heaven, then you have lost this grace that saved you, right? Paul is saying you can't be too good to where you don't need it. Because I've heard that some Judaizers have been saying that good people go to heaven. I've heard that some other teaching have been sweeping in our very city right here that says I'm a good person and my neighbor's a good person and good people should go to heaven. But if that was true, the gospel wouldn't be one size. Am I teaching too much for you here? All right. If that were true, the gospel wouldn't be one size fits all, because then it couldn't fit bad people. What about bad people? If the gospel was, if only good people could go to heaven, then it's not good news, because the gospel has to be fitting for bad people as well, because everybody in your family is not good, because you're praying for some people right now, and the reason you're praying for them is because you know that they're not good. So Susie might bake the cupcakes, but what about Rodney, who's in prison? I need you to think about this, because it's really important that you understand that the gospel you believe has to be a one-size-fits-all. If Jesus is going to fulfill all nations, all people of all times, the gospel cannot be those people who do this, and this. If you baptize right, if you go to the right church, what if the right church is not in my city? I need to be able to do, what is it that I need to be able to do to be saved? If it's restrictive and if it's not one size fits all, that's your test. It's probably not the gospel. Paul is passionate about this thing. Paul says that I was so good. I was good in Judaism. You guys follow me? He was good in he says, listen, I was better than everybody else. I knew more than everybody else. I paid all my tithes. I did everything I was supposed to do, but I still needed the grace. I still needed the gospel. But he says, I was bad. I used to murder people. I sat there when they stoned Stephen, and I held their coat, and I was throwing a stone too. I killed Christians. And so he says, I was bad and I needed it, but over here I was really good and I still needed it. He says, I stand in the tension of these two things once more. I need the gospel because I'm fully good in Judaism, and I'm fully bad in morality, and the gospel needs you, and you need the gospel. It's made for you. It says, Paul, I want to read this quote from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says, Christianity must be from God, because who else could have thought it up? C.S. Lewis is a great thinker. I just think it's a funny quote, because I'm like, you can't think of this. Paul says, it's not human wisdom. It's not, you can't make a one-size-fits-all religion, because every other religion, and I've searched it out, I've learned that there's certain religions that I would be of a lesser class because of the color of my skin. So the color of my skin is not fitting for certain religions, even religions that claim to be Christianity. It doesn't fit me. That means that it's not the gospel, because it doesn't fit me. For some people, there's certain things that you can't do. Oh gosh. All right, I'm sorry. I said I wasn't going to edit the video because I'm trying to not edit stuff out of the video tonight. All right, this is how the gospel is a one-size-fits-all. Paul says, I want you to circle this part. He says, he set me apart. God set me apart. And this is where I need you to hear this. Right here is where the gospel begins. Paul says, God set me apart before I was in my mother's womb. That's where the gospel of grace began. I could breathe that in for a minute. The grace that saves you begins when God sets you apart. Set apart. That's another word for holy. To be set apart. Paul said, God set me apart as holy before I came out of the womb. before he had the opportunity to make his mother mad, God set him apart. It means that God has chosen you. This is where grace begins. Grace does not begin with your choice for him. Paul says, I chose him later on. Dozens of years later, while I was on my high horse, I realized the grace that was holding me from the time I was in my mother's womb. But the grace didn't show up then. The grace was always back here. In fact, I'll tell you that grace is not a response to sin because God is not responsive. The grace of God existed before the foundations of the world because Jesus said, I want you to love them with the love that you love me with before you made the world, which means that God had a love before there was hate. Love is not a response to hate. Love just was from the beginning. That God had a choice for you and that he did not create something to save you. The thing that saved you was the purpose he always had for you. The purpose cuts through your problems to continue to save you because it is that strong. The grace of God is not responding to your problems. It has always been here for you. Paul said, he set me apart and called me and chose me. It was working for me before I was even here because you have great grandparents and God was saving them and moving them because you were the seed that was in them. You have to understand, this is the grace that saved you. Well, do I need to be baptized to be saved? What? You lost your mind? You're crazy? Before you were do I need to? So these questions you guys had, right, over the culture believes in morality. As you guys think about, that's why I picked that game tonight. Because as you guys think about those questions, these are things that people say, well, you can't be saved unless you. Like, do you still drink? Because, and now you got to lie that you don't drink because it's just crazy. It makes you crazy. And now I'm working to be saved when God was already working before I was in my mother's womb. He did the work already. That grace already prepared for me and set me apart. And here I am, 30 years later, I'm trying to earn something that he did, and I'm making God guilty because I'm giving him 2 payments for something that he already paid for it to happen. And grace is not a new plan. It says you were called by grace. I want you to circle that. You were called by his grace. I just want to give you something tonight that as you go home and as you start to study, that there's something in your heart that you're connecting to. I want you to realize why as you read this, Paul is pissed. Paul is mad. It's like when he starts off, he's cussing people out. Like you're going to see later, he gets all up in the other disciples' faces. It's like he's ready to go. Not because, he's like, I'm on the fringes. I ain't trying to impress nobody. But if you think I'm going to let you tell all these people that they need to work for something that God did, he's been way too good for me. He's given me a message. I will not let this injustice continue. This is what the reformers did in the 1500s when they realized that the church was selling indulgences. They said, I'm willing to die for this because if people don't know that grace saved them, salvation is by grace alone, in faith alone, through Christ alone. He said, I will not let the church continue without them knowing the Christ who died for them. Salvation is free. You don't have to pay for it. And Martin Luther said, I'm willing to die for it. Hundreds of reformers said, I'm willing to die for it. I'm willing to split the church and mess it up. I'll piss off whoever I need to because I need you to know that God loves you and you don't need to do anything for it. Paul is mad. Paul is mad. Paul is mad about it. He says, I need you to know this because you're about to give this to your children. And you're going to cause your children to work for something that God was working out in your womb. You remember when you were rubbing your belly and blessing them? That was God loving them. And now they grew up and you're teaching them the dirty doctrine. So Paul was mad. And Paul said you were called by this grace. I know some of you think that. Some of you still question your call. I don't know if God is calling me. And the reason why you're questioning your call is because you're looking at your skills. I'm going to teach this for a minute. I know I like to preach too, but sometimes I just got to get this. You remember I told you that if you move away from the grace that saved you and you go too far from it and you start to blame yourself for things that are happening that are bad, like God is punishing me because I did this. If you start to blame yourself for the bad things, you'll take credit for the good things. You guys remember that? Right? If you blame yourself for the bad things, you will take credit for the good things because it's the same coin, just a different side. And Paul says that it was by his grace that he called me, which means that when you question if you were called, I don't know if God called me. What is the basis of it? Your skills. You're saying, I don't know if God called me because I'm not skilled. So you think that God calls people because they're skilled. Do you understand the other side of that coin? I don't know if I'm called because I don't have those giftings. Some of you in this room should be leading, and you're still questioning if you were called because you're looking at your resume. God did not check your resume when he called you. He checked it himself. Let me tell you how God decided that he was going to call you. God says, I'm going to love you with the love that is in me. And the reason why he has to love you with the love that is in himself, because there's no love outside of himself. He can't look inside of you to find it because there's no love in you without him. So he searches for passion within himself and says, I'm going to love you with my love. I'm going to save you with my grace. I'm going to give you my, because there's nothing in you, and I need to put it in you because you were born dead. And so if you're questioning your call, and I want you to know tonight that God is not calling you based on your qualifications. He's not checking your resume. He doesn't care about your LinkedIn. He says, I'm going to call you because I set you aside from the time you were in your mother's womb. And I believe that there's something in the churches like the Judaizers who are telling you that you need to get a little more qualified before you get called. And Paul is mad. Paul is just mad. Paul is mad about it because this is the truth about grace. And people around you perhaps. I love these lights on. I can see your faces. This is beautiful. Because some of you in this room, I think about this. I'm telling too much about myself, but I have a really hard time, just being a pastor, doing this. Do you know how much of a step? Do you know how many people had to talk to me? Because from the time that I was young, I had a speech impediment, and I stuttered, and I still stutter. And it's an embarrassment for me every time I stutter. And so there was something that said, if God is going to call you, Denvil, he's going to call you after he fixes your speech impediment. But I was waiting for God to do something. Before I started talking, he called me. Before I said mama, he called me. Before I stuttered in the world, he called me. And I need you to understand that he's not waiting for you. He's not waiting for you to get better. He's not waiting for you to figure it out. He said, I called you before you could disappoint me, before you could impress me. I did it already, so quit trying. Just say yes. And some of you in this room, you know that you're called. And tonight is probably just time to just say, I'm going to stop trying to die to get this life. You're still dying to live. Paul says, stop it. In verse 15, Paul says, but when God, who set me apart, say, set me apart from my mother's womb and called me, say, called me, by his grace was pleased. Paul says he was pleased to do it. It's like he had pleasure. It was in his pleasure that he did it. Not in your performance, but in his pleasure. He found pleasure within himself. He didn't look around to be pleased. It was his own good pleasure why he saved you. And so Paul is a carrier of his grace. And so Paul goes on and he says, my immediate response was not to consult human beings when I discovered this grace. Paul says, when I discovered this, and he knocked me off my horse, and I realized he called me before I was in my mother's womb, and I killed so many people, and I was good in Judaism, but I was bad with humanity and morality, and then God caught me in the clutches in the midst of it, and he says, I don't care about your Judaism, and you're doing good, and I surely don't care about you killing people and being bad, because this is one size fits all. Paul says, when that happened to me, and he says, I want you to go and give this thing away, and I want you to tell them, Paul, because you are educated in Judaism, because you know stuff about Judaism, and Jesus said that this thing is connected to Judaism. Because Paul is not Peter. Peter was a fisherman. Paul studied this thing. And so God says, I'm going to use the thing that you've been studying for a long time. What the enemy meant for evil, I'm going to use it for good. Because you were using this thing to persecute Christians, but now I'm going to take you, Paul, and I'm going to rip this thing through you. And you're going to use that same information to help connect people back to the Judaism. Because Jesus said, you need to search through the Torah, through the Never Him and the Kept of Him to find me. And Paul, you know the Torah by heart. And so this was a setup the whole time. Some of you went to school and studied stuff that you don't know why you studied it. And still paying for it. Glory to God. Glory to God. There's a special blessing for you now, right? But some of you, and I know you probably don't know why you did it, but God said, I sent you into some places, and the things that you have learned, the day is coming. If you say yes when I knock you off your horse, I will lead you into the place where that is going to make sense here, because there's somebody who needs what you have, even though you think that you don't need it right now. Paul says, I thought it was to boast and to impress people. He says, no, I'm going to use you to connect the New Testament to the Old Testament, because this is where people are going to find Jesus. Yet you have to understand why Paul is so important in this. And y'all still looking for Matthias. He ain't writing no gospel. I mean, I don't want to go to heaven and see him. He gonna be mad at me, right? But I mean, but like I know, like this was man's pick. Like, I wanted to write a sermon about Matthias because I thought that there were some people who got picked last. I thought that there were some people who never got picked, and you saw people who got picked over you. And it doesn't matter who gets picked over you. Some of you had people who left you for somebody else, but it's when God gets a hold of you, you won't even hear about Matthias anymore because the 11 didn't pick him. The 11 didn't pick Paul. They didn't think about Saul. They were the last person who he would pick. And I want to write a message about it because I think there's some people, you're the last one you think God would call. And he says, that's the one I want. The one who's killing the Christians, that's the one I want. The last one they would think of, that's the one I want. I want you to understand how important Paul is to this game. That's why he's mad. It was his pleasure. Paul says, I didn't go to get the approval of anyone. When this happened, he says, I went to Arabia, and later I returned to Damascus. And in chapter 2, go to Galatians chapter 2, Paul says, then after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem, and this time I went with Barnabas, and I took Titus along with me. But I went in response to a revelation to meet privately with those esteemed leaders. Like Paul is saying, I did not go to get the approval from the apostles because I don't need their approval. They didn't pick me, so I don't need their approval. If I had time, I would tell you to stop trying to go back and get the approval for people who didn't pick you anyway. If they didn't pick you, then they didn't pick you, and move on. If they didn't want you, then Paul says, I'm not trying to impress them because they didn't draw my straw. They took Matthias. God is the one who found me on my white horse and picked me, and so I'm going to go be with God. And I think that some of us just need to stop trying to be and impress people who didn't pick us in the first place. Paul says, I waited 14 years before I went up there. Paul says, I went in response to a revelation. And the meeting with those esteemed leaders, that's what he calls them, the esteemed leaders of the church, they're in Jerusalem. He says, I presented them with the gospel that I preached. So I'm telling them now what I preach. Listen, Peter, this is what I'm preaching. Thomas, this is the gospel that I'm preaching. That it is by the grace of God that you've been saved, that you don't need to follow any law, that you just put your faith in the Jesus, the Christ that has come. If you just trust him for what he say he's going to do, you don't need to do another thing to be saved. He says, Peter, that's the gospel I'm preaching, and I'm not asking for your approval. I'm just telling you to let you know, because there's some Judaizers who are coming in and messing it up, and they trust you, so I just need you to tell them it's okay. Some of you didn't catch it. It's okay. You catch it on the video. So he says, I presented them with the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles, and I wanted to be sure that I was not running a race in vain. That's why he went. Because the churches respected those apostles. So Paul said, there's some Judaizers who are messing it up. I'm not here to get your approval. I'm here to use your authority. I'm here to use your authority to make sure the gospel message stretches through. And so, Peter, here's the message I'm preaching. Will you tell these people that it's the right message, please? Because Judaizers are coming in, and they're questioning my authority. And I went up there for you. I went up there and I faced these people for you. Not for approval because they don't like me, they didn't pick me. I went up there for you, church in Galatia, so that you would know that these people who you think are high and mighty, that they also have the same gospel that I am preaching. And Paul says, when I went with Titus. I'm in verse 3 in chapter 2. And he says, when I went with Titus, though, and I shared this gospel with them, they didn't demand that Titus be circumcised. Not even Titus. They demanded to be circumcised. So I want you to understand that when I went to the people who you think are high esteem, I don't know who you think is high esteem, but let's just play with this for the sake of teaching, right? For the sake of teaching, I want you to just pretend Pastor Kevin. Pastor Kevin is our senior pastor, my pastor, and my leader. And you have high esteem for Kevin. And you hear that Pastor Denvil is teaching some stuff on Wednesday night Bible study. Pastor Kevin, I need you to put your hand on this because I need to know if it is true. Can you watch that 1 hour video? He ain't going to watch a 1 hour video, by the way. That's why I make them 1 hour, right? And that's I'm just playing, right? And so it's like, Pastor Kevin, will you check this out? Will you put your hand on it so that you no? And so I would write to you and tell you, listen, I sat down with Pastor Kevin and we watched my 1 hour video. And so the people who were telling you that I'm gonna use baptism, right? Because baptism is like one of these things that I think makes perfect sense, because baptism is something that we encourage, but it's not required. And so people were in the church saying, oh, well, you need to be baptized if you be saved because I want to see you in heaven, so you need to get in that dirty water because we need to get you down, right? The water's clean. I'm just playing, right? And it's not. So Pastor Kevin would sit down with me and watch this video, and I would say, hey, I took Jesus with me, and he's not baptized, and Kevin didn't force him to be baptized. So not only does he approve my message, I brought an unbaptized person with me, and Kevin didn't say he needs to be baptized. So I need you to know that Kevin not only approves my teaching, but he also approves my teaching in the flesh. When Titus came, they did not tell him to be baptized, though he was a Greek, and he was a Christian. So I just want you all to know, because I'm not trying to win anything. I don't need y'all to like me. I just believe Jesus loves you, and I believe that Jesus loves you, and you ain't got to believe me or like me. But the problem with you not believing me is that it's undermining the grace that saves you. That's the only reason why. See, you ain't got to like me, but it's the grace of God. He died for this, and I want you to have it, right? And so, number 3, I want you to write this down. It says, the gospel is the only way to real freedom. The gospel is the only way to real freedom. So it's me and Kevin and Jesus, and we're sitting in his office. He approved my teaching, and I said, hey, by the way, Jesus is not baptized. Kevin didn't tell him to be baptized. And he said, but it was an issue, though. While we were up there, he didn't have to get baptized, but it was a conversation. And it was a conversation because there were some other people in that room. Those other teachers who were teaching you. Those other people who have infiltrated your mind. They were there. And they were on the other side, and they were saying, Kevin, you need to tell Jesus that he needs to be baptized. And he says, it wasn't a problem. Look at verse 4. This is what verse 4 said. The matter arose, however, because some false believers, I want you to circle that, some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ, to make us slaves. They were coming into the room, and they were saying, you need to tell him to be baptized because we believe that people need to be baptized in order to be saved. And Paul says, when we left, Jesus was not baptized. But it was an argument, however, because your same teachers were there. But the man who you approve, I hope this example is working, right? But Kevin, who you esteem, we fought together against those teachers for you. So here is Jesus unbaptized. Here is Titus uncircumcised. And the only reason I want you to know this is because if you don't believe this, the grace that saves you is at risk. You guys are good? I just want you to understand the flow of the story. He says we did not give into them for one moment. So the truth of the gospel, there it is, might be preserved for you. That's why he did it. So that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. The reason why I fought with them was that you would not abandon the grace that saves you and start to work for it. So that you would not abandon the freedom that Jesus has given you and become a slave to the good behavior that you cannot produce anyway. He says, I don't want you to start to work for something that Jesus already gave everything for, because God cannot have two payments for the same thing. It would make him a crook. And so they accepted Titus into the family of God. And I just want to give you two quick things here. I'll try to make them quick. Where the gospel gives us true freedom. And it's in this text. I want you to see it. The gospel gives us cultural freedom. If you have a little notepad, I just want you to scratch that down. The gospel gives us cultural freedom. Cultural freedom. In moralistic Christianity meaning that you become a Christian or you are saved by morality, by behavior, by things you do, you earn your way into good standing. And when someone asks you, are you a Christian? You say yes, and then you start to tell them about your Bible. That's moralistic Christianity. When someone asks you, are you a believer? And you say yes, and you start to tell them all the reasons why, and none of them is because he snatched me when I was drowning. That's moralistic Christianity. Moralistic Christianity is not a one-size-fits-all, because every culture has a different set of morals. And so when Jesus comes, he says things like, love your neighbors. And moralistic Christianity would require you say things like, this is what you ought to eat, and this is what you ought to, your children have to do this, this is the way that you have to behave, it restricts your diet, it restricts what you can do. That's moralistic Christianity, and some of those things exist even still today as it did back then, right? You need to listen to certain types of music. I know some of you right now, if I scroll through your YouTube history, but don't feel bad, because I know that Eminem just dropped an album. And you can be mad at me if you want to, but I'm not saved by the music that I listen to. That's just the Judaizers that want you to change the station when you get in the car, because they want you to prove that you're saved, not because of the grace, that amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I was blind, and now I see. That's the grace that saved you. And so you can try to prove your salvation. That's moralistic Christianity. And so with moralistic Christianity, it's not a one-size-fits-all, because Africans cannot be saved. And this is one of the things, by the way, even right now, we have to understand that our faith, right now, some of you who do missions, the honesty in missions is when we go into a culture and we don't force them to be white America. It's really important. Because when we go into other cultures and we teach them that in order to be Christians, you need to sing Hillsong. And here's why, because we're uncomfortable with their garb. When Muslims get saved, they don't need to start wearing skinny jeans. Because the gospel infiltrates culture. All that needs to happen, Jesus will snatch them up out of the water they were drowning in with their garbs and all. He will pull you just as you are. But when you forget the grace that saved you, you'll forget that you were in some things too, but it wasn't in the way you dress. It was in your heart. It was in your behavior. It was in your text history. It was in your online searches. It was in places that nobody could see, and he picked you up out of that thing just as you were. But when you walk away from the grace that saves you and you step into another country, you will act like you are something else and call them to be something that you were not, and you're restricting the salvation and the grace that saved you. The same way that you came in is the same way that they're going to come in, on your high horse like Paul. It's the same way that you're going to come in. Paul is saying, I don't want you to forget how you were saved, because this gospel has to spread. And the reason why you're having a hard time sharing your faith with your coworker is because you're so concerned about their behavior. And the reason why you won't share the gospel with the lost and with your neighbors is because you think they've got to stop smoking weed immediately in order to be saved. But I love the Miami Vineyard because you can come in here smelling like weed and we'll still give you donuts and coffee. That was not an endorsement for him. I know, it sounded like it. I'm sorry. This is the second week I do that. I'm going to edit that out. All right, so moralistic Christianity cannot save you, right? The second thing, and this is how you find it, right? So we're talking about how do you find, how do I know? When a tradition is elevated to the standard of a non-negotiable, and here's what I mean by this. Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. He lived a perfect life. He died a sacrificial death. He rose on the third day, and my faith in him saves me. He died for my sins. He died in my place. Now, anything outside of that that's strictly cultural, like ladies need to wear long dresses in order to be saved, is a moralistic thing. You're taking a tradition and you're putting it into something that is required for salvation, and it's no longer fitting for the whole world what God said in Genesis to Abram. I'm going to use you, what Jesus said he's fulfilling in Abram for the whole world. That's how you find moralistic Christianity, when traditions become non-negotiables. When traditions become non-negotiables in a church, that's when you found it. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And that is it. That's how you get here. Now, when you're here, we're going to want you to stop smoking weed. But you can come, because you're not saved by moral Christianity. And the second thing that the gospel frees us in is emotional freedom. It gives us emotional freedom. And I'll probably end on this point tonight. I just have a whole lot. I told y'all I've been on this for a while. I just got to stop at some point. But moralistic Christianity doesn't work. And the freedom that the true gospel gives, it gives us an emotional freedom. And I want to talk on this emotional freedom because these are the things that are in our lives, and for some of us, even in this room, where our emotions are sucked dry because we're continually trying to live up to a standard that we cannot live up to. You're continually trying to earn good standing with God, and let me tell you, you just cannot. I want to burst that bubble tonight so that you can get your feet back on the ground, get back in the water, and experience the clutch of the Savior that pulls you. You cannot ever do anything in your life to earn right standing with God. Your right standing with God comes only through Jesus. And when you put your money in his bank, it's safe. And I think that what happens emotionally for us, we get this emotional freedom. Have you guys ever had something happen and you physically feel the weight lifted off of you? That's what the gospel does. The gospel does this because it says, I've been trying to get this thing, I'm trying to figure out if I can, but when you let the gospel really penetrate you and humble you, it will lift the weight off of your emotions of trying so hard, because we're still working to be loved. And I know that I'm talking about working to be loved with God, but it stretches into your emotions, because eventually it goes into working to be loved by people as well. Remember, I told you Paul stood on the fringes. He was rejected by Christians and rejected by Jews, but by the love of God, who he knew loved him and chose him before he was in his mother's womb and called him by his grace, Paul says, I don't need to work for love. As a Jew, he doesn't need to work for love anymore. He says, I don't mind being rejected. And there's some of you in this room, perhaps, I'm suspicious, that you might have relationships that you're still working to be loved. And I think that some of that gets worked out when we go back to the grace that saved us. When we go back to the grace that saved us, and we spend some time in humility and just allowing the love of God to love us right where we are, like just with all of our stuff. And you just remember, this is how he got you. This is the best kind of love. And there's a freedom that comes there that extends into other relationships. And that I don't need to work for love. And I think that this happens a lot, and I think that this can free, whether you're married, whether you're single, whether it's your parents, whatever it is, when you know that you are loved by God. Like I said, it doesn't happen in a great worship song. It doesn't happen when you start speaking in tongues. It doesn't happen. It happens at the point of salvation. That is the deepest point of love you can ever feel, because it's just as you are. If he starts to love you after you start coming to church and after you start to get it all right and after you stop doing all this stuff, you have missed out on the depths of his love. Because the depth of his love is, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And it's that kind of love that frees your emotions to walk boldly in these relationships. And some of us put up with things in relationships that we just don't need to, because we're still working for love and it's killing you emotionally. And some of you allow people to speak to you in a certain way and treat you a certain way and deal with you in a certain way because you haven't felt the value of what it means for somebody to love you as you are. This is why Paul is so serious about this. He says it'll ruin your life because you're dying to live. I'm asking the worship team to come back up.